proud of you. In chapter 13, if you did well on 12, you're going to do great on 13 also, because it is very, very, very similar to multiplying decimals. Now we're going to move on to dividing decimals. So we're going to start today with, there we go. We're going to start today with lesson 13.1. So that's on page 288 of your textbook, but you don't even need to open your textbook. I'm going to always have it right here on these videos, unless you want to open it up and do some more examples in case you're struggling. And always, always, guys, if when I get done with the video and you have done the lesson and the IXL or your assessment, if you are at a point where you still do not understand, that is the great time for you to reach out to me via email, and I will Zoom you and try to explain it in a different way if the video and the lessons and the practice did not help. So if you remember way back to the beginning of chapter 12, when we started multiplying decimals, our very first lesson was called multiplying by powers of 10. I'm going to go back to that for a second because our lesson today is going to be very similar. So you remember a power of 10 is something like 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, right? These are all powers of 10, right? So we learned that if you multiply a decimal, let's take 3.5. If we multiply a decimal by a power of 10, let's take 100, for example. That's a power of 10. All you do to multiply a decimal by a power of 10 is you move that decimal point to the right the same number of zeros in your power of 10. So for instance, we're going to move it over 2 places. So this 3.5, or 3 5/10, we move it over once, we move it over twice, it's going to go right there. So our new number is going to be 350. And this makes sense because you always want to make sure that your answer makes practical sense. If we started with 3 wholes and 5/10 and you multiply it by 100, that means it's going to get significantly larger because you're multiplying it by 100. So that 3.5 became 350. So that makes sense. Now, if we look at today's lesson, we're going to be doing something very similar, but we are going to be, let's get rid of that multiplication sign and change it to division by a power of 10. Again, powers of 10 being 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. If you divide by a power of 10, you do the same thing. You look to see how many zeros there are. There are 2. But we're dividing. So dividing makes things smaller. Multiplying makes things bigger. So it made sense when we multiply, we move it to the right and it gets bigger. When we are dividing by a power of 10, we do the same thing, but we move the decimal point the other direction. We're going to move it to the left. 1, 2 spaces. So now our 3 5/10 becomes only 35 thousandths. That got much smaller, which makes sense because we're dividing it into 100 pieces. Okay, so that is our lesson for today. That's the first part right here. Okay, it says right here to divide a number by 10, 100, or 1,000, move the decimal point to the left as many places as there are zeros in the power of 10. And then it gives us an example here. 35 divided by 10. You can see there's 1 0. So we take that decimal point and they moved it over 1 spot right here. And they got 3.5, which is smaller than 35. Makes sense because we're dividing. If you take 35 and you divide it by 100, there's 2 zeros. So we moved it over 2 spaces and you end up with 35 hundredths. They give a little reminder here, which we've already talked about. We never want to write a decimal point as the first thing. You're always going to want to add this 0 right here. So going over to our whiteboard over here, I'm back over here now. This is not how we would leave this. 35 thousandths, we would actually add a 0 in the ones spot because it says include a 0 in the ones place when the number is less than 1. We never leave that ones spot open. Okay, back to our problem. 35 divided by 1,000 has 1, 2, 3 zeros. So we're going to move the decimal point to the left 3 times and end up with 35 thousandths, which is much smaller than 35 wholes. So you know you've actually gone the right direction. All right, so that was our first part of dividing by powers of 10. If you remember, again, back to our first lesson with multiplication, the other way we divided by a power of 10 was, let's go over on our whiteboard here, if you have 3.5 and you divide it by 10 to the second power. When you have an exponent, rather than the zeros telling you how many spaces to move it to the left, the exponent tells you. So this says move it to the left 2 spaces. So it would go 1, 2. And we would have 0.035 or 35 thousandths. Okay, let's look at some examples here, right here in our lesson. 7 divided by 10 to the first power means you're going to move the decimal point 1 spot to the left. So now it becomes 7/10. That makes sense. It's smaller than the original. 7 divided by 10 to the second power means you move the decimal point over 2 times. 1, 2, and you end up with 7/100. 7 and 10 to the third power, you're going to move that decimal point over 1, 2, 3 spots, and now we have 7 thousandths. Okay? Study these examples. Let's go ahead and do that together. 1,285 divided by 1,000. That means you're going to move the decimal to the left 1, 2, 3 spots, which you can see that they did right here with the little arrows. 1, 2, 3 spots, and now we have 1 and 285 thousandths. Here we've got 8,734 divided by 10 to the fourth power. So we're going to move that decimal point over 4 spots, which they did, and got your number right here. And then we've got 490 million divided by 10 to the sixth power, which means we're going to move the decimal 6 spots over, what they did right here, and you end up simply with 490. All right, let's get to some practices. Number 1, 52 and 4/10 divided by 10. How many zeros are there? It's referring to this right here. There's 1 0. So we are going to move that decimal point 1 to the left. So from here over to there. So our new quotient is 5 and 24 hundredths. All right, number 2, 8 and 3/10 divided by 100. How many zeros are there? 2. So we move that decimal point. Let's make it bigger here so you can see it. Move this decimal 1, 2 spots. It would go right here, which means we need to put a zero in the place, and also a 0 in right here because it's less than 1. So what is our quotient? You would write it as 83 thousandths. And number 3, 6,120 divided by 10 to the third power. That 3 tells us move the decimal point over 3 spaces. So let's do that. The decimal point right here now is right there. So we're going to move it 1, 2, 3 spots over, and there it goes. Our quotient is 6 and 120 thousandths. Now, you don't really need this 0 right here because it's not showing any value and it doesn't hold a spot. Okay? Describe how to divide a number by a power of 10. You move the decimal point to the left, the same number as zeros or the same number as the exponent. Let's do a couple more examples so you feel ready. Let's go to page number 2. All right, here we go. Let's pick another one. Let's do this one right here. I'm trying to find ones that might throw you a curveball. All right, let's do it over here on this side where I've got a little bit of space. I have 1/10, and it's saying divide it, 1/10 divided by 10 to the second power. That exponent tells you move the decimal to the left 2 spots. 1, 2. The decimal point goes here. I need to fill in this space with a 0. Because it is less than 1, I need to also put a 0 in the 1 spot. So the answer for this is going to be 1,000th. Okay, let's scooch all the way down to number 23. These directions say compare, right, greater than, less than, or equal to. All right, so basically all you're doing is figuring out two problems. They kind of smushed two into one, and then you're figuring out which one is larger. So here's our first problem is 109 thousandths, but you're going to multiply it by 100,000. So how many zeros do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've got to move that decimal over 5 places. All right, let's do it up here. We currently have 109. So you're moving it to the left. Oh, I'm sorry. Look at that. I didn't even pay attention. Look at this right here. It's a multiplication sign. They snuck one of those in here. Okay, so good thing for me to pay attention, Mrs. Van Zanten. I always tell you guys, watch the operations, and I just completely thought we're in division here, and so I didn't see that multiplication sign. Okay, so we're multiplying, so we're moving it. Which direction do we move for multiplication? We want it to get bigger or to multiply, so we move it to the right. So we go from 109 thousandths, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to go right there, 2 zeros, okay? So now we have 10,900. That sure did get bigger. We're going to decide if that is larger than or smaller than or equal to this problem over here. So here we have 10,900,000 divided by 10 to the 4th power. This 4 tells us move this decimal point from here 1, 2, 3, 4 spots. So now we have 1,090. So this one is larger. All right. So watch out for those. See, here's another one here that's got a multiplication in it. Watch your operations. I think that should be good, guys. You can go ahead and do whatever assessment I have assigned you, whether it's an IXL or a worksheet. Go ahead and do that. If you still feel after you've done that like you really don't know how to do this, that's your time to send me an email and we can set up a Zoom time if you're not understanding that. Once you've watched the video, please make sure you watch these videos first though before you before you email. All right, good luck guys. You're going to do fabulous at this. Have a great day.